If you're raising a child with autism, you've probably experienced the confusion that comes with trying to make sense of it all. One expert says one thing, another says the opposite. And social media is full of opinions. Every week there's a new therapy, a new program, a new approach claiming to be the answer. And somewhere in the middle of all this noise, you're trying to figure out what's actually best for your child. That's why I recommend Lynn R. Curry and Elevate How You Navigate. Lynn is the father of an autistic son, host of the Autism Parenting Secrets podcast, and someone who understands firsthand how overwhelming the autism journey can be. His focus isn't on adding more noise. It's on helping parents gain clarity, confidence, and a practical path forward. Through his coaching and guidance, Lynn helps parents cut through the noise, sort through conflicting advice, and make decisions with greater confidence. The goal isn't to tell you what to think. It's to help you navigate your family's unique situation with greater certainty and purpose. Lynn offers a free strategic clarity call where you can discuss your family's challenges, explore opportunities for growth, and identify meaningful next steps. To learn more or schedule your free call, visit elevatehowyouNavigate.com. Because when parents have clarity, they can navigate with confidence, and that can make all the difference in the world. First, I would like to mention MAYU water. If you're trying to upgrade your hydration, MAYU uses a vortex flow system that mimics how water naturally moves in rivers and streams. That motion helps increase oxygenation and release unwanted gases like chlorine, improving overall water quality and making it easier to stay consistently hydrated. But here's what most people overlook. Hydration isn't just about water. It's about minerals and absorption. MAYU allows you to remineralize your water with essential minerals and electrolytes, supporting cellular hydration, energy levels, and overall physiological balance. When your water has the right structure and mineral content, your body can actually use it more efficiently. If you care about hydration, performance, or just feeling better day to day, this is one of those simple upgrades that adds up. You can get 10% off with the code AUTISM. Next, Daylight Computer Company and Daylight Kids. These devices are designed to work with your brain, not against it. And honestly, the future of tech is already here. Most screens are built for stimulation, bright, fast, and attention-grabbing. But that often leads to eye strain, mental fatigue, and disrupted sleep. Daylight takes a different approach. By reducing blue light and lowering overall sensory load, these devices support sustained focus, calmer attention, and healthier sleep patterns. For anyone who feels drained after screen time, or for kids whose nervous systems are still developing, this creates a much more natural, regulated way to engage with technology. If you want your tech to support your brain instead of overstimulating it, this is worth checking out. Use code AUTISM for $50 off. And finally, Chroma light devices, lights designed for humans. Natural light contains a full spectrum that our brains and bodies are tuned to. But most modern indoor lighting falls short of that. It's often narrow, harsh, and out of sync with how we're designed to experience light. Chroma is built to bring that balance back. These lights are designed to better reflect the qualities of natural light, supporting your circadian rhythm, reducing sensory strain, and creating environments that feel calmer and more aligned. That can translate into better sleep, more stable energy, and a nervous system that isn't constantly being pushed toward overload. If you have ever felt off under certain lighting and didn't know why, This is worth exploring. Get 10% off with the code AUTISM. If you're optimizing your environment, your focus, your well-being, your nervous system, these products are worth checking out. For today's episode, we are going to talk about temptations, a way to look at previous episodes. From the autism episodes, the neuroscience and biology, and the whiteboard series episodes, these autism and the structure of reality episodes, you can begin to ask, what owns you? Where does your life come from? In the sense of your perceptions, your reality, your actions, what owns you? In the Autism and the Structure of Reality series, we have built something. Part 1 was the self, with Carl Jung. Part 2, the self integrated with the crowd, with Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and Dostoevsky. Part 3, the mind itself, and how reality is constructed through perception, filtering, salience, predictions, errors, and compression. Part 4, how shared reality stabilizes through collective agreement, illusion, and reality. And Part 5, how systems are built on top of that shared construction. Systems like schools, workplaces, social norms, institutions, all things that develop you, and your internal calculators, your values, beliefs, phenotype, personality. These structures built around one dominant model of reality. Can you fit in or not? Are you like the so-called normal people or not? If the self has structure, the crowd stabilizes perception, the mind constructs reality, and systems shape behavior. The next question, what actually guides the self inside of all of that? What dominates you? What owns you? Because perhaps the deepest tension in human life is not simply between the self and society, the mind and reality, or the individual and the crowd. Perhaps the deeper tension is, what structure will the self ultimately live under? And maybe that is why the story of the 3 temptations in Matthew 4 has remained psychologically relevant for thousands of years. Not because it is simply a religious story, but because it describes something timeless about human beings. The temptations are not random. They are 3 proposals, 3 tests, 3 ways of structuring reality. 3 answers to the question, what is life actually about? And perhaps what makes them so powerful is they are not ancient problems. They are modern life. The 3 temptations did not disappear through time. They became systems. The 3 temptations matter, and the wilderness, the setting, matters. No crowd, no social role, no system, no comfort. Just the individual confronting what is inside themselves. And psychologically, that matters. Because throughout this series, we have returned to one idea. Much of modern life prevents direct confrontation with the self. Systems keep people synchronized. Crowds are stabilized through perception. Social structures reward performance so that the system can continue. And constant stimulation prevents stillness. But the wilderness removes those stabilizing layers. And once they disappear, what remains? Jung becomes extremely important here again. Jung believed that beneath the persona, the social interface adapted for collective life,
there existed deeper psychological structures. Things like instincts, drives, fears, desires, unconscious motivations, and the shadow. The shadow was not simply evil. It was everything within the self that had not been consciously integrated. And perhaps temptation is one of the mechanisms that reveal the shadow most directly. Because temptation exposes what the self moves toward automatically, what it fears, what it seeks for stability, and what it believes will finally resolve its internal tension. And maybe this is why temptation feels so powerful. Because temptation is not merely offering behavior, it is offering identity. It is offering structure and guidance. Guidance, and we will talk about in a future episode, the Lord's Prayer. You will be guided. You will be led by something. Temptations are saying, build your life around this. Temptation is not simply about doing the wrong thing. It is about organizing reality around the wrong thing. The first temptation is simple, and it appears to be hunger. Turn these stones into bread. But psychologically, the temptation is much deeper than food. The temptation is, let need define reality. If you feel discomfort, remove it. If you feel emptiness, fill it. If you desire something, obtain it or seek it. Life becomes organized around relief. And perhaps this is the dominant structure of modern life. Endless stimulation, endless comfort, endless distraction. A civilization increasingly organized around convenience, instant gratification, dopamine regulation, and avoidance of discomfort. Our reward system is built with effort first, then rewards. If you bypass the effort, you are hijacked. So everybody today is essentially hijacked. The modern world is extraordinarily effective at reducing friction. The food, entertainment, validation, and stimulation. Social media owns you. Things like DoorDash and all of these delivery systems own you. All immediately available. And yet many people feel increasingly fragmented. But why? Because comfort and meaning are not the same thing. Dostoevsky understood something profound here. Again and again, his characters resist systems that promise comfort at the cost of freedom or depth. The brothers Karamazov argues repeatedly that human beings often prefer bread, security, certainty, and comfort more than truth itself. And perhaps modern systems increasingly agree. Because systems operate more smoothly when discomfort is minimized and behavior becomes predictable. But psychologically, something dangerous begins happening. The self becomes organized around avoiding discomfort instead of pursuing meaning. And this connects directly back to neuroscience and the internal calculator's framework. The brain continuously computes reward and cost, uncertainty, effort, control, and predicted outcomes. Our net benefits. Remember the value machine. We called it the scoreboard, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. It's calculating rewards, minus metabolic cost. And that's a net benefit. And if it's biased towards reward, the reward is more valuable than the metabolic cost. It will repeat. If the reward is lower than the metabolic cost demand, it will avoid. The brain is not simply reacting to the world because of this. It is predicting the world and updating itself through repeated patterns. Repeat versus avoid. And perhaps this is a deeper psychological danger beneath the first temptation. Repeated alignment with relief progressively trains the internal calculations within the self. The system increasingly learns discomfort, then immediately relieve it. Short-term reward begins dominating long-term meaning. Over time, this reshapes habits, attention, emotional tolerance, motivational structure, and eventually personality itself. We built the belief systems in the two parts of the internal calculators. And perhaps modern systems continuously reinforce this loop. The brain learns patterns. You can think of this as internal calculators constantly evaluating what relieves pressure, what reduces discomfort, and what works quickly. And perhaps this is where thought itself becomes extremely important, because temptation rarely begins at behavior. It begins as interpretation. It begins as a thought. And perhaps one of the deepest mistakes human beings make is assuming that every thought arriving in consciousness deserves belief, engagement, emotional commitment, or identification. But thoughts are not neutral. Thoughts often emerge from fear or defensive structure, impulsive valuation, insecurity, avoidance, or the nervous system's attempt to stabilize itself quickly. Allostasis are actions to return the living organism to homeostasis. It doesn't like the friction. It doesn't like to work. It just wants to respond. And perhaps this is why thoughts can feel so convincing. Not because they are fully true, but because they reduce the tension. A thought does not know you. It may be attempting to understand you, or worse, understand your weaknesses. But you are not obligated to entertain every thought that appears. You do not have to commit yourself to it. You owe your thoughts nothing. And perhaps this matters psychologically, because repeated identification with certain thoughts progressively reorganizes the self. Thoughts become patterns. Pattern becomes valuation. And valuation becomes your behavior. Behavior becomes identity. And eventually, the self becomes organized around whatever patterns consciousness repeatedly agrees to identify with. And when discomfort is repeatedly escaped, rather than integrated, patterns form. Discomfort equals avoid. Over time, the response becomes automatic. And perhaps this is why temptation reveals structure so clearly. Temptations do not randomly target the self. They target weakness. They expose fragmentation, instability, unresolved fear, impulsive valuation, emotional avoidance, and whatever the organism is using to stabilize the self. Because biologically, the organism naturally moves toward relief and certainty, predictability, and short-term stabilization. And temptation exploits that tendency continuously. So perhaps temptation is not merely offering pleasure. Perhaps it is progressively reorganizing the self around whatever provides relief most quickly. And perhaps this is why repeatedly following temptation becomes psychologically dangerous. Because eventually, the self is no longer consciously choosing the structure. The structure becomes automatic. And perhaps this is one of the hidden dangers of modern life. Many people are no longer consciously choosing comfort. Their nervous systems have become organized around it. Jung might call this the instinctual self, the instinctual layer of the psyche. Not wrong and not evil, but dangerous when it becomes the organizing principle of reality. Because now life itself becomes compressed into comfort, stimulation, relief, and survival. And perhaps this is why so many people feel simultaneously overstimulated, comfortable, entertained, and deeply unfulfilled. Because the self cannot fully develop if discomfort is always escaped before meaning can emerge from it. The first temptation is not merely about hunger. It is the belief that relief is the same thing as meaning. And the second temptation shifts dramatically. Now the temptation is not about need, it's about image. Throw yourself down and be seen, be recognized, be validated. And perhaps this temptation dominates modern society even more deeply than the first. You post everything on social media, everything. You're searching and seeking validation, affirmations, everything. You put on social media, all your good deeds land on Facebook. Because modern life increasingly rewards visibility. Social media, performance identity, branding the self, curating perception. Maybe the worst thing that people put on social media is doing a good deed, donating something, providing lunch for a first responder. And you put it on social media, like, look at me. I like to think of this as the look at me crowd. The self becomes something displayed. And this maps almost perfectly onto Jung's idea of the persona. The persona is a social interface, the version of the self adapted for collective life. Every person develops one. But when the persona becomes disconnected from the deeper self, life slowly becomes performance. And perhaps this is where many people begin losing contact with themselves. Not because they are intentionally dishonest, but because modern systems increasingly reward the presentation, signaling, visibility, and synchronization with collective expectations. Soren Kierkegaard warned repeatedly about the crowd, not because groups are automatically evil, but because crowds stabilize identity externally. The crowd tells people what matters, what is admirable, what is successful, what is normal, and even what is real. And once identity becomes externally stabilized, people begin performing themselves back to themselves. And this is where social reality and temptation intersect. The second temptation reveals how the self itself becomes compressed in order to fit shared construction. The individual began asking, How am I perceived? How am I accepted? Am I visible? Am I recognized? And perhaps this is one of the hidden psychological costs of modern digital life. The self slowly reorganizes around external visibility. Internal calculators begin learning. Insecurity, then perform. Even speech. Don't miss that. The speaker speaks to calm the self. When you have insecurity, you have actions, a performance. And speech is included in that. Validation itself becomes a reward signal. External perception increasingly dominates valuation. And perhaps this is one reason modern identity becomes so psychologically unstable. The self begins organizing itself around thoughts generated by external perception. What owns you? How am I seen? How am I evaluated? How am I interpreted? And eventually, thought itself becomes socially conditioned. The mind continuously explains the self back to itself through comparison, visibility, feedback, validation, and crowd perception. And perhaps this is one of the deepest dangers of the second temptation. The self slowly loses direct contact with itself underneath performance. And over time, the self can slowly reorganize around visibility rather than authenticity. The persona strengthens, and eventually, the individual may no longer know what is authentic, what is adaptation, what is performance, and what remains underneath the performance itself. This connects directly back to the earlier episodes on social illusion and systems. When systems reward performance consistently enough, people begin mistaking social synchronization for identity itself. Jung warned about this in The Undiscovered Self. The danger is not merely wearing the mask. The danger is forgetting that it is a mask. The second temptation is not merely vanity. It is building the self around being seen. And the third temptation is the deepest: power, control, and authority. All the kingdoms of the world. And perhaps this temptation increasingly defines modern systems, not simply political systems, psychological systems, the need to control outcomes, to dominate uncertainty, to impose certainty onto reality, to force complexity into simplified structures. Throughout this series, we have repeatedly explored compression. Systems compress, crowds compress, shared reality compresses. And perhaps the drive toward total control is the ultimate form of compression. Because control attempts to eliminate uncertainty entirely. Nietzsche becomes irrelevant here. Nietzsche understood that systems and crowds often seek stability before truth. Difference destabilizes systems. Complexity destabilizes systems. And uncertainty destabilizes systems. So systems move toward predictability. And we love that. And psychologically, individuals often do the same. People seek ideological certainty, rigid identity, and absolute answers, simplified narratives, total explanations. Because uncertainty is psychologically expensive. Remember the metabolic cost. But Jung warned about something extremely dangerous here: inflation. Inflation occurs when the ego begins identifying itself with something larger than itself. The ego becomes morally absolute, ideologically possessed, psychologically rigid, and convinced it fully understands reality. And perhaps modern society increasingly rewards inflation because certainty spreads faster than nuance. Simplified narratives spread faster than complexity. The crowd stabilizes certainty more efficiently than ambiguity. And this creates a dangerous loop. The brain increasingly treats uncertainty itself as metabolically costly. Remember in the internal calculators episode, the anterior cingulate cortex. This is a region of interest even for the autistic phenotype. We hate uncertainty. Control begins functioning as emotional regulation. Certainty becomes rewarding. Ambiguity becomes threatening. And perhaps this reveals something deeper about human thought itself. The mind does not merely experience reality. It continuously explains reality to itself. And many explanations do not emerge because they are fully accurate. They emerge because they psychologically stabilize the self enough to reduce uncertainty, ambiguity, fear, vulnerability, and internal tension. And perhaps this is why ideological possession becomes so powerful. Because certainty often feels psychologically safer than direct contact with complexity. And eventually, the internal calculators begin prioritizing psychological stability over direct contact with reality. The truth will set you free. Internal calculators begin learning uncertainty, then control it. The person seeks more certainty, more dominance, more explanation, more control. And eventually, reality itself begins shrinking into whatever the ego can comfortably manage. This may be one reason modern discourse increasingly feels polarized and rigid, absolute, and psychologically hostile. Because many people are no longer trying to encounter reality. They are trying to stabilize themselves through certainty. And perhaps this is the deepest temptation of all. Not pleasure, not visibility, not like the first two temptations, but becoming the center. The third temptation is not simply power. It is the desire to replace reality with control. The temptations are not random. They form a progression, need, image, and control. And perhaps modern society increasingly organizes itself around all three simultaneously. The first temptation structures consumer systems. The second structures social systems. And the third structure ideological and institutional systems. And all three interact continuously. Systems sell relief. Platforms reward visibility. And institutions stabilize control. And perhaps this explains why modern life can feel psychologically exhausting, even when material conditions improve. Seek the word vanity in Ecclesiastes. Vanity is fleeting. Life is fleeting. It's temporary. Because many people are being pulled simultaneously toward stimulation, performance, and control. And each one reshapes the self. The temptations reveal the psychological and computational engines underneath those structures, not merely moral failures, but repeatedly training architectures, patterns that progressively shape value, attention, prediction, identity, emotional response, and policy selection. Perhaps this is why temptation matters so deeply, because eventually the person is no longer consciously choosing the structure. The structure becomes automatic. And perhaps this is why the story still feels modern, because the same distortions still organize reality. Only now they are scaled at widespread ability. The temptations did not disappear. They industrialized. Modern systems may not create the temptations, but they amplify them continuously. And this leads to a deeper question: the structure of the self. If these distortions organize modern life so effectively, then what does transformation actually look like? Modern psychology often speaks about structuring the self, self-actualization, the realization of potential, the expansion of the self, the movement toward becoming more fully oneself. And there is truth in that. And perhaps self-actualization becomes dangerous when the self lacks orientation. Because then, becoming yourself can slowly collapse into comfort, image, or control. All of these are vanity. The issue is not self-development. The issue is what structures that development. What owns you? And perhaps this connects to something deeper many people feel: a sense that current life is not enough, a sense that there is more to experience, more to become, more to understand, more life than what currently exists inside the boundaries of ordinary existence. Regret, guilt, and shame are deep. Earlier, we discussed this as the void, not something broken, but an awareness that current experience is incomplete, and perhaps desire itself emerges from that awareness. The desire to expand, the desire to move toward current limits, the desire to become more fully alive. And maybe that is why human beings repeatedly seek meaning, transcendence, love, growth, revelation, and transformation. Because the self senses unrealized capacity. And perhaps this is where logos becomes important. In John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word. The Greek word there is logos. Logos means word, order, structure, reason, and meaning. And within Christian theology, Christ becomes the connection between divine order and human life. Not merely belief, alignment. And perhaps this is the deeper contrast beneath the temptations. The temptations offer distorted structures, need, image, control. And perhaps the deeper danger is not merely behavior, it is progressive identification. Because the structures organizing attention, eventually began organizing identity itself. The self slowly becomes shaped by whatever it repeatedly pursues, values, reinforces, identifies with, and emotionally commits to. And perhaps this is why consciousness matters so deeply, because the self is not merely shaped by what it does. It is shaped by what it repeatedly agrees to become psychologically organized around. Logos offers orientation toward meaning, truth, and reality itself. And perhaps transformation ultimately means not escaping the self, but becoming a self no longer ruled by what distorts it. And structuring the self without orientation becomes distortion. But aligned with logos, it becomes transformation. The next episode, we will dissect the Beatitudes, because the Beatitudes is the exact transformation path. The whole section is about self-transformation. So across this series, we have built something progressively deeper. Jung revealed the structure of the self. Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and Dostoevsky revealed the tension between the individual and the crowd. In neuroscience and our biology, the Whiteboard series episodes showed how reality is constructed through filtering, prediction, salience, and compression. Social systems stabilized those constructions into collective reality, and institutions harden them into structure. And now we arrive at something deeper still. The question is no longer only, what is reality? How is it constructed? How do systems shape perception? The question begins, what ultimately structures the self? Because every person is being pulled continuously toward comfort, image, and control. Your reception determines transformation. Are you going to be the sower, the beatitude? And modern systems increasingly amplify all three. So perhaps the deepest challenge is not simply resisting temptation. Perhaps it is learning how to organize life around something deeper than the distortions, constantly competing for ownership of the self. Temptation is the mechanism. Discipline is the process. Strength is what is built. Logos is the guide. God is the source. Self-actualization is the result. And perhaps the final question underneath all of this is not, what do you believe? But, what owns you? The structures that organize your life eventually become the structures that shape your life. Thank you for listening to From the Spectrum podcast.